Welcome, Piali, buenos dias, Kenwa, Hambio. I hope you all are well. Welcome to another week of New Mexico Literary Landscapes and Beyond. Hopefully you all have been enjoying the course so far. Uh, Keep up the good work too. Everyone's turning in some pretty cool stuff. Inspiration forums always looking good. Um, and so this week is pretty cool. Last week we kind of talked a little bit about uh, uh traditions of death and stuff like that too in New Mexico. This time, and which is awesome. And I want to apologize. Last week I was a little bit off, so my bad on there. Hopefully you guys still enjoyed it. Um, but yeah, cool. So this week we're going into New Mexico folklore, the tales and traditions that are attached to that as well. And so this is actually one of my favorite lessons uh, because it offers us an opportunity to kind of dive into uh, all the amazing stories and stuff like that that make New Mexico and the surrounding areas so interesting, you know? And we talked a little bit too, like about dichos and stuff like that too last time. And so same this week, we're gonna kind of dive into that, but we're gonna go into folklore more, uh, which is like one of my favorites too. I'm a folklorist as well, and like that's another part of my uh being an arbiter of the traditions of New Mexico is sharing that. And so I want to go ahead and share some of those stories. A lot of the stuff is stuff from my familia too. And so some of these stories end up being things that I've heard and my family's heard for a long time. And so and they're very similar to other stories that I hear other people share as well. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of do that. I'm excited to share these stories with you all and hopefully you enjoy. This is like my favorite lecture for sure. Bueno, let's get started. So, New Mexico folklore, cuentos y dichos, and I'm going to talk about a little bit about all of those um, because they are an important part of it. And we're going to go through different stories and historical things like that too. I'll share a couple of books that you guys might want to look into if you want to learn more about these traditions and these stories. So folklore, let's talk about that first because like that's an important thing to discuss too, is like what is folklore, right? And what's the importance of them? Well, for one thing, folklore are these tales and stories or cuentos, and even like I said, dichos and stuff like that too, that really help transmit and also preserve cultural values for a specific group. And that would be like us in New Mexico. Like we have certain traditions, we have certain pieces of our culture that are connected to even pieces of folklore, right? And so that's one thing that's kind of cool about them is there's those stories, and they go back way back in time. Like these are things that we've been seeing indigenous communities all over the world do, and just different cultures all over the world have participated in the use of folklore as a means of being able to um share culture, share some of these traditions and stuff like that too. But the most important thing, and a lot of them are tied to like even things like safety, right? So like it says like uh one of the things that a lot of pieces of folklore use are to educate kids and to keep them how to keep them out of danger, but then also to teach them about cultural values as a society or group, right? And so that's another part of it um that is important about folklore. And so for a longest time, like when you talk about indigenous communities, like that was the way of teaching kids to be careful and to respect nature and things like that too. Remember we did the Native American tutu stories, right? Like a lot of times those are ways to teach them about animals, teach them about mother nature, teach them about like avoiding certain things, you know what I mean, that could be dangerous to them, right? And that was like a big one for us even here in New Mexico, being that we do have a lot of indigenous roots here, but this is also stuff that was brought over with the Spanish too. Um, some of those same stories were embedded within their culture too, for the same reasons, maintaining traditions and culture, but also for safety and to establish connection, right? And so that's a big part of it. And it also serves as like a way to motivate people to engage in culture and stuff like that too. But it's also a way for people to understand it too. Because sometimes there's things within our culture that are hard to understand and we don't get. And even in like a more modern context, we see that a lot. Why? Because we're not living in a time period where there's necessarily people having to like worry about bears or worry about like different kinds of animals attacking them, because we live in urban areas now and stuff like that. It's less rural, right? Although there are rural communities, don't get me wrong, like that's real stuff, but like on the real, most of us live in these communities where we don't engage with that kind of stuff, so it's kind of different. So now the pieces of folklore are tied to just maintaining culture, and that's kind of a beautiful thing. And I have some like cool photos here that I like to share, um, because they end up being like things that are totally connected to us. So like things like spirits walking around and brujas and La Llorona, which I'll go into more detail of too, because there's all these different stories that are attached to this that make our lives embedded with some of this stuff, right? Like all of us can attest to those stories, the boogeyman, um, El Cucuy, like all those stories that we hear growing up, right? Like those are all tied to it too. And there's always like it's funny because it's like Aesop's fables. Like there's always something to be learned from the cuento, from the story, right? It's not always just like, oh, here's a story to try to scare you, or there's a story to about this person. Like there's usually a moral to the story, right? And so that's one thing that's always kind of cool about folklore and that I love about it too. And it gives you a glimpse into like the culture as well, because usually the story has examples of what the culture is like within it. So when you hear a story or a cuento from these groups, um, usually there's something that is connected to like uh, the norms of that culture. And that's one thing that I love about folklore too, is that it gives you like a glimpse into the culture through a little story, right? So let's get into it. So New Mexico folklore, I kind of use like scary font here just because it's like I always tell as a folklorist in New Mexico, I always tell stories like during the Halloween season. It's always funny to say that too, because like there's always stuff attached to that. And so I do like storytelling. And so I go to these different communities or go to different spaces and tell these stories. And it's really fun. People get scared, and it's just a good time, but it's a great way for us to continue to maintain those stories, because there's a lot of people that even from here that I've never heard some of these stories. And so that's why it's important to continue to do it. So part of my uh sustaining my opportunity to sustain these cultures is by me doing that, right? By me doing this storytelling. So I'm going to give you guys some of those stories today so you guys can learn them and maybe share them with other people. All right. Bueno, let's get into it. So witches, all right. Brujas, right? Like we hear about them in different ways here in New Mexico. Anything from pieces of literature, like we read all over the world. Like example from here would be like Bless Mi Ultima from Rudolfo Anaya, and other examples like that end up being like where we hear about witches and witchcraft and stuff like that too. And we have like a deep history with this too, because this isn't something that's new. This is something that we've had for a long time. Even in the indigenous communities here, witchcraft and witches were a thing too. Um, anything from like uh um the Wahona or other witches that were embedded in like indigenous cultures too. were also a part of the stories. And a lot of it was tied to keeping people kind of scared, right? Like to not engage in certain things. And you have to remember too, like even when the Spanish came and they brought the Spanish Inquisition, anybody who was not practicing the faith that was prescribed by the Spanish crown were considered witches, or were could be considered witches, I should say that. And so that fear of even like being a witch was bad too. But even knowing a witch was like another thing too, right? And the thing about it is like witches could cast spells and all this stuff too, right? Some of the witches were shapeshifters too. And that's another thing too, right? Is like that's another part of it that people don't really understand either. And so witches end up being a big part of the stories that we hear within the communities here in New Mexico or the Southwest. And so witches uh end up being part of like this whole story um where we hear about children going missing and things like that too. Um but there's a bunch of different stuff. Like one of them like we have like on the borderlands too here is La Lechuza, which is like a lady that can turn in switch between a an owl and a woman, right? And La Lechuza is another one, and La Guajona is another one, and it's almost like she's like a were not a werewolf, a vampire, right? And so like which is pretty cool too. So I'll tell you guys a little bit about that as well because there's some pretty cool stories in regard to that. Um so I want to make sure I share that with you all too because it's something that's just really really cool. So the Wahona is or Lumia is a like an old lady figure, and this one comes basically from Europe. So we get this from the Spanish. And she's like an old lady wearing a cloak. And she kind of walks around, and she has like a her hands or feet are like snarled like a bird. Um, and she has razor sharp teeth, two little razor sharp teeth. It almost looks like Nosferatu. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that old um vampire, and her teeth are actually used to suck blood out of people, but she doesn't like suck your blood till you die. She just sucks your blood like in the night, um, to where you feel weak the next day, right? Mostly of children, and some adults, but she does that by doing them and leaving them um nearly bloodless, right? And so one of the story it goes, and this is like from Fredolin Vigil, who collected this story here in New Mexico, um, where she's he what happened is he was leaving Taos, New Mexico, to go to work, and while he was walking, he saw this old house, and this old woman in a black outfit asked for help moving this trunk. And she said she was just waiting for someone big and strong, like him, to come by to help her because he could do it easily, right? Well, what ended up happening, oops, what ended up happening was he ends up stopping to help her, and the two push the trunk in side, and she helps lift it with like a broom, right? To push it, like give it like using some fulcrum, some physics. And they finally move it inside, and then they place it in the kitchen, and she insists that she repay his kindness by offering to make him dinner, right? And so in our culture, it's impolite to refuse people that would do something like that, make that offering of food, to deny them the opportunity to feed you, right? So he decides to stay and eat. She serves him beans and green chili stew and asks her his name, and he says, "My name is Fredolin Vigil." And she said, "Vigil comes from the word vigilante, and you are alert and watchful. That's what that means, right?" And she tells him her name is Wahona, and that's what they call her, and it's like stuck since she was a little girl. Um, and no one else really knows her name, that's just what everyone calls her. Well, it starts getting late, and he's like, time flies, she's like, time flies when you're having fun. And he says, well, I need to get going and it's dark and in the bosque. So he's like, well, I better get going. And she asked him, well, why don't you just stay the night? It's already too late. It looks pretty gloomy outside. You should just stay here. I'll set you up with a spot, right? And so he obliged, and he stayed in the kitchen, in a room next to the kitchen. The room had a bed and blankets. They were soft and cozy, like at his grandma's. That's what he said, and it's like it felt like I was at my grandmother's house. Well, around 2 in the morning, he woke up to her putting wood in the fire and smoking a cigarette. Uh, then she stripped off all her clothes and rubbed something all over her body. And what ended up happening is she turned into uh, um, a creature, right? And she turned into this creature that tried to attack him. And so he runs out scared right in the middle of the night, 2 in the morning, and escapes his with his life intact, right? Um, and she had two fangs like that. And she looked like a decrepit old lady and had like a birdish nose and stuff. And so that was one of the tales that we hear of the Wahona. Um, the other one too that we hear sometimes too about witches is um is people flying on brooms, right? And stuff like that too. So that's kind of an interesting thing too. The story I wanted to share was from my abuela told me, uh from Puerto de Luna, uh uh New Mexico, over by Santa Rosa. And she said, next door to her house growing up was a lady that lived there, and she was always wearing black. Her name was Doña Fidelia. And Doña Fidelia was known to be a ghost. I mean, not ghost, a witch. She was known to be a witch. Like everyone in the community knew that. Everyone was kind of afraid of her. Whenever she would walk by her house, she'd snarl at you, and she was pretty mean. And she had two younger daughters, or sorry, three younger daughters, uh, that were like, when my abuela was a little girl. So my abuela was like probably like 10 or something, and the girls were already teenagers. And she said they were really beautiful, and all the boys were after them, right? Even my abuela's brothers and cousins and stuff like that were all in love with Doña Fidelia's daughters. Well, during certain times of the week, usually on like Friday night, she said that they'd get home, and their mom told them, you need to get home before it gets dark, because Doña Fidelia does magic, right? And so my abuela said it would be getting dark, and we'd run home, and we'd have to pass by Doña Fidelia's house. And she said, and she would like snarl at us, right? And so she says we took off and we went into the house, and she said that they used to get these like blackout curtains, like black curtains, and put them in front of the window, so you couldn't see what Doña Fidelia and them were doing, right? And my abuela, being the curious young lady she was, uh curious person she is, I should say too, because she's 101, still alive, and very curious woman still too to this day. She could see on the outside of her window, right? Like between the curtain and the window, you could see light coming through. And this is in the middle of the night. This is like when it's already dark, like 8 at night, right? After dinner. So she goes and she moves the curtain to the side so she could see. And Doña Fidelia had made a big bonfire. And the bonfire was there in the backyard. And my abuela was looking, and Doña Fidelia was teaching her daughters how to fly. And so they had to go over, and they were jumping over the fire, and then they would try to fly a little bit, and then they would fall in the fire and catch on fire, and then she would yank them out, and they would be fine, they wouldn't burn. And then she would make them do it again until they could float above the ground, right? And my abuela was watching this, and she said, and then all of a sudden, she said she looked, and Doña Fidela was there, and she turned back and looked at my grandma, and my grandma was like, nope, close the door, close the window, right? And so after that, uh, she was always like really scared to go even like pass by their house. She would walk way around and stuff like that too. And she said the daughters were like really pretty, but they were weird. And she said she swear my abuela swears she's like I saw them like fly and fall into the fire, and she just like would pull them out and they'd still be on fire, and then they would like turn off. The fire would turn off, and then she would make them do it again. And she said, and she could float, and it was pretty scary. And so that's the story my abuela always told me growing up, and my primas and primos and stuff like that too. And we never saw Doña Fidelia because she had died before we were born and stuff like that. Because obviously my grandma was a little girl, and but we saw the house or the area or the building was destroyed pretty much. But thing that was crazy is my abuela said some more stories. I'll finish with this part too for this section. So my abuela was like, um, one time Doña Fidelia, it was shortly after that. And then one time she said Doña Fidelia was they were walking her little cousins and her primas that were like her age were walking because they had like a little uh like area where they grew crops, like a little plot of land that was like just a little bit further away by the river, right? And so her and her cousins went over there because they were supposed to go pick vegetables and bring them to have for dinner. And this is a couple of days later, right? So they're walking by and they have to pass by Doña Fidela. They run because they see her, right? And she kind of snarls at them. Well, they go over there to go, and she goes inside right away. And they go inside the plot of land and start picking squash. All of a sudden, they saw this big bird like flying overhead, right? And they looked, and it was an owl. That's what my abuela says, un tecolote, right? There was an owl floating, flying above, right? And they didn't think anything of it, so this owl started making noise, and then it started sweeping down at them and like trying to hit like scratch them, right? Um, and she said and it was big, and she said it kept going by and trying to get us, and we were terrified, and so we started running. And she said one of my little cousins, little boy, he grabbed a rock, and the bird came and it came by the girls again, and he got the rock and he threw it, wow, and it hit the bird right in the head, boom, and the bird like dive bombed, right, boom, and hit the ground, and it was like dazed, and then they took off, and they said she said I looked back and the bird like got its like wits back and took off flying, right? So they started went back home, and then of course they forgot the squash because they were scared, so their mom sent them back. So they went back and grabbed it. When they came back, they saw Doña Fidelia outside of her house, and she was going like this on her head, and she had a big knot. And my abuela was like, "Yeah." So when my cousin threw that rock at the bird and it hit him in the head, hit the bird in the head, it was really Doña Fidelia. She had turned into an owl, and then so she had a big knot on her head, and she was mad at us. She was looking at us real mean, right? And so after that, she was like, so after that, we were really scared of her because we knew that was like kind of the story. Well, I love sharing this story too because there's a little pretty cool little addition to it. Um, my abuela was with her three cousins. Um, one of them he was a little bit younger than her. He's the one that threw the rock at the bird, and his name was Rodolfo, and we know him as Rodolfo Anaya. That's my abuela's cousin, her first cousin. And so, yes, he is my primo, which is always pretty cool to say, or was my primo. Rest in peace, Rodolfo. But yeah, and so he was the one that threw the rock at the bird. And you even see those kind of elements in his stories that he tells in his novels. In Bless Me Ultima, the witch, the way they describe him and stuff like that, is Doña Fidelia. So that's what I think is always cool to tell that story. There's New Mexico witch lights too. That's another thing. So people claim to see these lights where witches predominantly are. This is a picture of my cousin Deborah. She lives in Alamogordo, New Mexico. There's a little town right outside Alamogordo called La Luz, and La Luz is known for being a witch town. It's like a village. It's teeny tiny, and so it's a little witch village. There used to be a lot of witches there, supposedly back in the day. And so she was driving home. She worked doing work in Cloudcroft, New Mexico, and she was driving through La Luz, and she saw these lights on the side of the road, and she pulled over and took a picture of her camera, and sent that to me. So it's pretty cool. Witch lights are pretty common in a lot of cultures. It's a piece of folklore too, where the witches would have a light um to help guide them where they're flying at night. And so we see this in a lot of different cultures. Like we typically see it with them flying on a broom, and there's a lantern on the end. That's part of the witch lights. It's a kind of a cool thing too, but we have sightings of witch lights here in New Mexico and folklore surrounding it. Oh, this is another one, the Dog Man of New Mexico. So the story goes that in the East Mountains of New Mexico, uh there was several instances where people saw um this man that would look like he was half man and half dog or wolf, so like a wolf man. Uh and so people would tell these stories about their sheep going missing and all this stuff, and dogs and cats and stuff like that, and eventually even people being found mangled and stuff like that, or go missing, right? And so they always attributed it to the dog man or wolf man of New Mexico, right? And one thing that's interesting about this is iconography, or people can shapeshift, right? Is a common piece of folklore throughout the world. And so even in indigenous communities here, like I said, with like people that can shapeshift, I don't like going into too much detail about that because it's very taboo to talk about some of those things directly, but in European folklore that we saw that a lot, where people can shapeshift. One of them is the most known that we, or most well known, is the werewolf, right? And so the werewolf has different origins depending on what area of Europe you're in, but most of it's going to come from like the United Kingdom or Germany, where we saw them occur, where the oldest stories are. And so of course here in New Mexico, we have a werewolf as well. And so we've always heard those kind of stories of the shapeshifters, and they go by other names too in different indigenous communities too. But here in New Mexico we had that too. And that was the Dogman of New Mexico. Well, there's another story my abuela told me too that was really cool, really interesting. And so she said when she was growing up too, there was this man named Pate Lucero that grew up that lived over in Puerto de Luna too, in Santa Rosa area. And he was kind of different, like he was pretty weird, and like a lot of people were really um weirded out by him. Like they didn't like really talking to him. He was to himself, and he didn't like really communicate too much with other people. Kind of a recluse. He had a family and stuff like that too. And his my grandma's always like, his daughters were weird, man. They were just really weird girls and used to say all kinds of random stuff. And so she said, what would happen is Pate Lucero would like to go on walks at night, and he would take off in the middle of the night and real late at night and go for these walks into the pastura and stuff like that too. And everybody already thought that was weird. Like people didn't go and do that, right? Not like now where we go walk our dogs in the night or whatever, right? Like that just wasn't something people did. Why? Because they were scared of stuff too. Uh, well, what ended up happening is kind of the same thing that happened with the Dogman of New Mexico. People started noticing that sheep were missing and dogs would be killed, and things like that, right? Livestock and things, would they find them all mangled up and tore apart. Well, sorry, that's my cat. Um, well, what ended up happening is people started uh thinking that he was responsible for it, right? So they started bringing all kinds of heat on him, and so they started saying Pate Lucero's killing him and all this stuff, and someone had said that they saw him turn into a wolf, and that he was half man, half wolf, like a shapeshifter, a werewolf, right? And this is like in the 20s, early 30s. And my abuela was like, yeah, everyone said that Pate Lucero was a werewolf. And they started giving him all kinds of heat, even to the point like my great grandfather. was the sheriff. And so they call him up, and my grandma was like, yeah, they made him go. And so he went over there and confronted Pate Lucero, and asked him why he was going on these walks and if he did all this bad stuff. And they were like, no, no, no. He was like, no, no, I just go and walk and all this stuff. And they made him feel so bad that he actually left Puerto de Luna, him and his family, and they moved away. Guess where they moved? To the East Mountains, over here next to Albuquerque, over there like Moriarty and Edgewood area. And that's where he moved. And then that's where people continued to see their livestock being mangled and stuff like that too. And so when I asked my grandma, like, who was Pate Lucero? And she's like, he was a werewolf, right? And so kind of an interesting story there too. Dancing with the Ghost. This is one of my favorite ones too. Uh, I remember hearing this story as a kid too. And this one's kind of cool too because you get to kind of see it in different places around the world too, where we have these stories like that. And so basically what happens is there's pretty interesting story about and I heard it two different ways. The one that I'm going to share with you is the one that my family shared with me. Okay. And so what ended up happening is this young man uh just got back from, he was a soldier, and he just got back. He was actually young. He was actually a very young man too. He was um like maybe like 19 years old. And he had just got back home from being in active duty, right? And he pulled up in his truck and and made his way back home over to his community, right? And so what ended up happening is he ended up getting home, and they were like, hey, there's going to be a really a cool dance tonight. If you want to roll over there and have fun, like you've been out and doing all this stuff, you deserve like a little time to just be able to relax and see your friends and all that stuff again too, right? And so he went ahead and said, okay, I'll go. And so he went to the dance and was over there, and he saw his friends and stuff like that too. And then he met this beautiful young girl. He saw this beautiful girl across the hall or whatever, right? And he was like immediately drawn to her. Like she was so beautiful and just a really sweet looking girl too. And so he went over there and asked her to dance, and her asked her name and stuff too. And her name was Crucita. And so Crucita, he was like, oh, that's such a beautiful name and all this stuff, right? And then so he asked her to dance, and so they started dancing. And uh they were just couldn't take their eyes off of each other, just totally infatuated with each other. They played a bunch of different music, anything from like rancheras to slow dances, right? Where they just the whole night just dance with each other and talked and all this stuff. And so she ends up being like the most beautiful girl there, and she's a great dancer, and he's a good dancer too because of his travels. He went and he learned a little bit about that kind of stuff. And so whenever he ended up continue to dance her the whole night, um finally it was time where it was almost time for them to go and go home, right? And so he asked her if he could walk her home. And so she said, yeah, of course you could escort me home, right? And so he does so. And so whenever they were walking, she was cold, right? And so he got his jacket and he took it off and he put it over her shoulders. And he said, I don't want you to be cold, so you just wear my jacket. And then I'll get it from you later, or when you get home. And really he was like being slick with it too. He was like, I'll leave this with her, and then it gives me another reason to see her, right? And so I want to make sure that I see her again because I'm like head over heels for her, right? And so he goes and he walks her over there, and they get to walk. He walks her to her house, and she's like, "Well, thank you for a beautiful night and all this stuff, right?" And then they kiss each other, and then she takes off inside and is like giggling and stuff like that too, right? Well, what ends up happening is she takes his jacket. And so the next day he goes over there, and it was like I said, it was like a move, right? Like, I leave my jacket, then it gives me an excuse to go over there and ask for it, and then I get to see her again. So he goes over to her home again. He knocks on the door, and this older woman answers, and she's like, "Yeah, how can I help you?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm here to see Crucita." And the older woman looks like shocked, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm here. I wanted to see Crucita." And she's like, "Go away!" And she tells him, and he's like, "Why? I just want to see Crucita." And she's like, "Why do you want to scare me? Go away! Crucita's not here anymore." And she runs inside crying. And the soldier guy is just like, "What the heck's going on?" So then this young lady comes up, and she's like, "What are you doing? What did you do to my mom?" And she's like, he's like, "I just asked her if I could talk to Crucita." And the girl's like, "Why are you saying that?" And he's like, "Because I was just with her last night. I had a beautiful time with her. She's the most beautiful girl and sweetest girl I've ever met. And I was at a dance with her last night, and she took my jacket. I wanted to come get my jacket from her, my coat." And then the young lady was like, "That can't be possible." And she's like, "Why?" And she's like, "Let me show you." So they walk to the backyard. In the backyard, they walk into the and this was not uncommon for people back in this time period. He walks back, and there's a headstone. On top of the headstone is his coat, his jacket, right? And the headstone reads, "Crucita Delgado, may her soul find eternal peace." And the sister says, "My sister's been dead for like 8 years. There's no way you saw her." Um, and he's like, "That's my coat." And that's the time when he realized he had been dancing with a ghost all night. And he basically fell in love with the ghost. So kind of an interesting one too. There's other ones too that are kind of similar that people have. The other one I heard is like it was his Letterman jacket, and so there's different variations of it. But it is always that. Um, Another one's the black cat. This is a pretty common one too. We see this one in a lot of different variations in cultures around the world too. Black cats are always synonymous with like uh, scary folklore and things like that too. Um, and so basically what ended up happening is this happened in like northern New Mexico. It's always like in these specific communities, they'll bring these up, right? And so oops, this happened in northern New Mexico. Let me go back to my okay. I love that picture of the black cat. I have a black cat, so I love these kind of stories. So this happened in El Nido. And so what happened is there was this lady named Margara, and she had like an ugly nose and warts, like the stereotypical witch looking lady, right? Guys dressed in black and walked on the back roads and the hills looking for herbs. It's always like, let's make the curandera scary too, right? Like, and so people were afraid of her and suspected her of being a witch. And so there was this other man who lived there named Don Lencho, and he lived there with his wife and his daughters. Corina, his wife's name was Corina, and his one of his daughters' name was Sonia. And Sonia was very beautiful and young, and all these young men wanted to marry her or be with her, right? So one day Margara found her black cat dead, and immediately she accused Don Lencho of causing her cat's death. And Don Lencho stayed away from her, and his family knew they were to do the same. The next day, Margara made some bread and took it to Don Lencho and his family as a gift. He refused to eat it and gave it to his dog. The next day, his dog was found dead. And Don Lencho questioned Margara's bread and the death of his dog, and she denied the whole thing. And then a couple days later, when they were having dinner, they heard some commotion in their barn, and there was an owl in there scaring the cow. They got closer, they found the owl had pulled out one of the cow's eyes, right? And Don Lencho knew it was Margara and the that witch, right? And so she was responsible. So he threatened to pull out one of her eyes if she didn't make the cow better. And a few days later, he found his cow was gone and replaced by another. Then he started to get really busy and kind of forgot about what happened. And he kind of hoped that there would be no more trouble. But Margara wanted revenge. And so not long after that, Margara gave Sonia some candy to eat. And so within a few days, Sonia had become uh very sick, and she ended up getting these huge abscesses on her face, right? Like these abscesses, these growths, right? These bumps. And and it terrified everybody to see her. And so this once beautiful girl was now just looked hideous, to everybody. It's always like that too, right? And so her mother was crying, and they felt helpless, and she was felt like she was ruined forever. And then Don Lencho blamed Margara, and he found a black cat lurking near around his house. And so he said, I'll prove it to Margara, who has done this to my Sonia, right? And he knew the tricks as witches used in spells and stuff like that. So then Lencho made a big round circle in his yard and waited behind some bush. Next to the bushes on the high of the roof sat the cat, and the cat was looking down. Within moments, the black cat jumped off the roof and accidentally landed inside the man's circle. Immediately, the cat panicked when it discovered it couldn't break out of the circle. And so Don Lencho knew it was just a matter of time until the animal would transform into its evil human shape. It moved around and couldn't get out of the circle. Around an hour, the endless circling the cat turned into Margara. Look who it is, Don Lencho said. He was furious and continued to yell and so said, beware, old witch, you will pay. Don't kill me, Margara said, right? I'll do whatever you want. And Don Lencho replied, give my oh sorry. Notes. Uh give my daughter Sonia back her beautiful face, or I'll personally burn you. Margara knew that she had no business to she had meant business to, so she cured Sonia's face with herbs. In time, Sonia overcame her ill effects of the spell, and Don Lencho never forgave Margara, but she soon disappeared and never returned to El Nido again. A few years later, when Don Lencho was on his deathbed, he confessed that he had mixed some of the witch's own herbs into her food, which had killed her. A few people went to search for the body, but found only a skeleton in a sitting position. Sonia and her mother packed their belongings in a hurry and left El Nido, never to be seen again. Another cool one too. Don't mess around with witches, right? The prisoner. This is a good one too. So what ended up happening is like they had this fiesta, right? And this young man named Roberto uh ended up having this argument with this older gentleman named Nicolas. And the next day, Nicolas was found dead outside of his house. And before long, everybody started spreading rumors that Roberto was the one who killed him, and so he ended up getting arrested, right? And so the sheriff was eager to find him guilty as a murderer, despite any like solid evidence or anything like that, right? And so uh Roberto never had a chance, and he was tried, convicted, and sentenced to die. And they were going to hang him. Hold on a second, please. And so what ended up happening is he ended up they were gonna take him to get hung, right? And then they took him by the cemetery. That's where they would go to the hangings. And there was a couple hundred people there came to see Roberto die. And that wasn't very uncommon back then, right? And so they ended up doing it to kind of show people like you can't be doing this kind of stuff again. People or we'll kill you, like the eye for an eye kind of thing, and doing it in front of a large group to deter people from doing those things, right? And so they had him handcuffed and chained at his ankles, And then they walked him in front of the priest, and everybody was behind him. People were there. His mother was there, and she started singing some alabados. Um, and which were answered by the people. They would sing back, right? And so, if they asked the priest asked him if he had any last requests before he died, and Roberto said that he wanted to visit the grave of Nicolas, right, the man who he was accused of killing, and they granted him permission. So he went over there, um, and he approached the grave, and he fell to his knees, crying and praying, and suddenly the ground began to tremble, and it continued this matter for several minutes, and people were watching this, right? Everyone was freaked out and not able to move. And then soon after, the ground opened up, and the dirt was pushed upward. And then all of a sudden, the coffin tilted forward, and the lid opened, exposing the dead man to the eyes of the crowd, right? And so people screamed in disbelief, and Roberto was the only one who was not scared. Most of the people scattered and ran away. A few people stayed and with horrified looks on their faces. The priest who made the sign of the cross and ran his fingers to the back and forth of the rosary. Roberto moved closer to Nicolas and asked, "Do you believe that I am guilty? Am I the one who killed you?" And Nicolas answered, "No, Roberto, you did not kill me. I have come back to help you." With that, the corpse fell back into the coffin, the lid closed, and the dirt covered the coffin, and the grave once again appeared untouched. After what seemed a lifetime, the people were able to speak and move. Everyone who witnessed the astounding event learned something that day about unjust accusations. The astonished officials removed the handcuffs and chains. Roberto was found his mother, and they cried and held each other, scarcely able to believe this wondrous event, a turn of events. With that, Roberto took his mother's hand and walked away a free man. That's the prisoner, um, which is another great story. Devil at the Dance is another interesting one too. And there's different variations of it in different places. We've even had some of these variations of the story go back all the way into like medieval Europe, uh, and then even like more recent ones. And so I'll share the one that I was told. So the story goes, this young lady, um, and this is, I have to mention this, there's variations like all over the Southwest too. So places like Santa Fe, Cuesta, Mora, Santa Rosa, Las Cruces, Taos. I've heard different variations from different people of this story too. And so the story goes that in these old communities, they used to hold bailas, right? Or bailes or dances, right? And so one night they had one of these dances, and this girl, her name, but the way my abuela said, her name was Maria, and she was real beautiful, and that's my grandma's name. So she just kind of like making it herself, right? And so she wanted to go to the dance, but it was during Lent. You know, that was like a no-no. You're not supposed to go to do any of that stuff during this time. So what she did is she wanted to go really bad, so she snuck out. She got dressed in this beautiful red sparkly dress and snuck out of the house to attend that dance. And so she met up with her friends and started dancing away, having fun with her friends. And then from across the room, she saw the most handsome young man she's ever seen. Um, she watched as like every woman in their community that was at the dance was drawn to this handsome stranger, right? This beautiful young man. And so she went over there and was like with her friends giggling and stuff like that. And he just caught eyes with her from across the room. And my abuela's always like, it was love at first sight, like that kind of thing, right? And so she was there with her friends, and then all of a sudden that young man went over to her and he asked her to dance, and he asked her what her name was, and she was like Maria, and he was like, oh, it's such a beautiful name. Would you like to dance? And so she started dancing with him, and they were dancing all night long, having a lot of fun, just laughing and talking, all this stuff. And they were dancing up a storm, right? Like everybody was watching them. Like she said, like he was turning her, and they were doing all these cool moves and stuff, right? And everyone was watching them. And then all of a sudden, she said, she looked, and everybody looked freaked out, and everybody was looking down. And so she looked down too, and she looked at his feet, and he had hooves for feet. And then she looked up at him, and his eyes turned red, glowing red, right? And then he started to kind of float, and everybody scattered, right, and disappeared. And she ran off too, and she was screaming and crying. And that was the night when she found out she danced with the devil. And so there's like a bunch of different variations of that story that happened, like I said, even in medieval Europe. And there was one that happened in like the 70s over in uh different places. Like I think one of them was like um El Paso, Eagle Pass, places like that. The one that was most recent happened in the 90s, or sorry, later early 2000s, over in San Antonio, San Antonio, Texas, in a little bar called El Camaroncito, which is this one here. That this lady was dancing with this dude, and then they looked down and he had chicken feet. That's the other thing too. It's either hooves or chicken feet. And so in this case, he had chicken feet. And I remember my prima who lives in San Antonio sent me this clip about it then when it happened. Because we had been hearing that story forever, right? Another one of those cool ones. Everybody knows this one, La Llorona, right? La Llorona is the one that a lot of us end up hearing about growing up. And so there's a lot of historical context to this. So um, basically we have the Llorona come about in different um, places, geographic locations, especially here in like the Southwest and Mexico, Central America, and stuff like that too. But it also goes back to even places in Europe, all over. There's examples of the Llorona or wailing woman all over the place. There's the Banshee in the United Kingdom or in Irish tradition, who was a woman of the fairy mound or fairy woman, and so she was known for screaming and shrieking. Then there is the La Soyona from Venezuela, which was very similar to the spirit that we hear about here. There's the El Silbón or the Whistler in Colombia and Venezuela, which is also very similar to that. And then there's the Koenig, which was the Scottish version of like that too, or the Weeper. She would be crying, and then she would um, uh, get you and steal you. So there's all these different examples throughout the world, even ones in Greece and in different places in the continent of Africa. There's the wailing woman or weeping woman who goes around tries to take people. Well, they've even done like cool variations of it. There was a movie that came out a while back, La Llorona, which was pretty cool too. It was like a scary movie, but it was like really far fetched. Like there's a puddle on the ground, and the Llorona could come out of there and stuff. The Grimm's Tales did a really good variation of it too. It was like a TV series. They did a great variation of it too. Um, but this story goes way back, and it stems from uh the different Azteca or Mexica goddesses too. And that's the Cihuacoatl. And Cihuacoatl was the ruler of Cihuateo, Teteo, which was like she was the woman, the spirit or deity who uh, was there for women, especially during childbirth and for being a mother, right? And so she was always a character. Uh, um, uh, and what would happen is like when women would die during childbirth and stuff like that, she was the one that was like responsible for taking care of them, I guess you would say. Um, and on certain days of the year, she would go and around the crossroads seeking victims, specifically children. This is like an old like Azteca story, right? Well, we heard about those same kind of stories too later on through the Aztec Empire, and they were even chronicled by uh, people like Fray Diego Duran, who was a priest for the Spanish. He's the one that wrote all these down. Um, and so there's a lot of different examples of what ends up being La Llorona. And so basically, what ended up happening is she ended up uh, being called like mala madre or the bad mother, right? And so that was Efron Franco Frias, who was another chronicler who wrote this stuff down. And basically, it was like La Llorona ended up being attached to even people like Hernan Cortez. And so people have this tied to La Llorona through La Melinche, the story of La Melinche, who was someone who was connected to Moctezuma. Some stories it's his daughter, some stories it's like a niece or something like that too. And so she's the one that kind of led Cortez and them to Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, and then that's when all this happened. And she was remembered as a traitor and also the mother of the mestizo people, right? Because she ended up bearing children from Cortez. And so Malinche ends up being connected with La Llorona on many accounts. And part of it, like there's stories where Malinche killed her kids when she found out Cortez was betrothed to another woman from Spain. And so that ends up influencing some of the stories we hear, right? And so the one that we hear in New Mexico, the one that I was told, was it began like in a small village a long time ago. Uh, and so what it was happening is like this is during the Spanish colonial times, right? And so this beautiful young girl, again named Maria, and the stories I always hear growing up because my grandma would always make her name, right? She caught the attention of all the men in this community because she was very beautiful. Um, and she was supposed to be married off to someone older nobleman in the community when she was a teenager. But what ended up happening is she ended up falling in love with some other guy, right? This other young well-to-do man, this son of these rich Ladinos, right? And so what ended up happening is he they fell in love and they ended up having kids. And so they kind of married each other like just to themselves, right? Like before God or whatever, right? And so they ended up marrying each other like that. But they weren't officially married. But she ended up having two children from him. And so what ended up happening is he had to go travel a lot and stuff like that too, and because of his family and stuff. Well, what ended up happening is his family ended up setting up a marriage for him with a younger lady from a really well off Spanish family, and she was really young and beautiful. Well, what ended up happening is Maria ended up finding out about it, and so she confronted him, and he was like, "I'm sorry, there's nothing I can do. Like, I have to marry her. I love you and I love our children, but I have to. Like, there's nothing I can do about it." And so there's two different variations. That's the one that I remember hearing. The other one that I've heard too in this, and my grandma kind of goes between both of them. And the other one was that he was um riding in a carriage, and that young Spanish woman was with him, and Maria was on the side of the road walking with her kids to the river. And whenever she saw him with her, she stopped them and pulled them over, and he pulled over and got out of the carriage and was like, I'm sorry, and explained things to her. And Maria got into a fit of rage and took the kids away, right? And she did the same thing in the other story too, where she got mad at him because he told her that, and she's like, well, I'm gonna take our kids. And he was like, no, I'm gonna take them with me to Spain when I go. And that was when she went over the edge. She went and got the kids and took them over to the river, and she threw them into the rushing water. Well, then she figured out what she had done, and so she started running along the river trying to catch them. Mis hijos, ay, mis hijos, oh no, mis hijos, and like trying to catch them, right? And she finally ran into them further downstream, and she found the boys, and they were both dead. And so what she did, she jumped into the water too, and was swept away from the current and was never seen again until people started seeing her roaming around the arroyos and riverbeds as like an old scary hag, right? Like the Llorona, right? And she roams around looking for her children and crying out for them. And if you're there and she sees you, she'll snatch you up and you'll take her their place, and she takes you away with her. Um, and so you need to be careful when you're by those, right? So it's like how we grew up listening to those stories. And so we used to like scare each other all the time, like growing up by the bosque over here too. We would go run around over there. And I remember like one time my cousins were there and it was starting to get like dusk or whatever. And I hid behind a tree and I was like, ooh. And my cousins heard it and they ran their little butts off, right? And I remember like walking out laughing. And then I started hearing, ooh, you. And I remember like looking back and running up the hill to where my parents' house was. And I looked back and my sister popped her head out, right? And so like we just used to do that with each other. But it's pretty wild. Another cool story with the Llorona too, and this is something that we hear a lot. People have different variations of it, which is pretty cool too. But typically they're all around the same. My father-in-law, who grew up in northern New Mexico, over by Mora, he lived in a small town, Rainsville, which is around 5 miles away. Well, my grandfather, my grandfather, my father-in-law was the rambunctious one of his family. So he would like going to the dances in Morra. And his mom and them would tell him no, and she would tell him like, if you come home, the Orona's gonna get you. And he was like, whatever. And there's a Morra little river that flows through there, right? The Morra River. And so he said I would go to the dances, and then at night when it was late after the dance was over, like 11 and midnight, I'd have to walk back like 5 miles. He didn't have a car. And so he would walk back between the pastura and the road and the river. So the road was here, the river was here, and the pastura he would walk on, right? He said every time he'd be walking home, he'd hear crying by the river. "Ooh, ah, like crying like that. And he said, and I would get serious, I'd run home every time. And he said, sometimes it'd be 5 miles, sometimes it'd be 3 miles. I'd run home every time, but I'd still go and do it, right? And he said one day he was walking home from the dance and he heard it really bad. And so he freaked out and started running. He saw lights coming towards him on the from the road. So he ran and waved down this truck. Inside the truck was this old man. Old man opens the window and said, get it, pendejo. What do you want, dumbass? Right? And so my father was like, La llorona, la llorona. And the old man starts laughing, right? And so when he goes, get in the car, pendejo. And then and so he gets in the car. Oops. He gets in there, right? And so then he ends up getting in the car with the old man, and the old man is like, um, you wanna see the Llorona? I'll show you the Llorona. And he gets the car, he gets my father-in-law, holds him in place, and he puts the car in gear and drives towards the river. He gets to the river and he's like, you wanna see the Llorona? Here's the Llorona. And my father-in-law is like freaked out, right? And he's like, no, and he's like, let me show you her. And he turns the lights on and points, the car's pointing at the river, and you see all these little foxes jumping around, right? And he goes, listen. And then you could hear the foxes crying. And that was that was the thing he was hearing this whole time, was that, right? And so after that, he said he wasn't as scared, but he still kind of was. But it's kind of an interesting, kind of funny story to hear about that too. And you hear about people saying that they hear that even like in other places where they think they hear a woman crying and it's really an animal like the fox, right? Um, well, they use this to their advantage too on us here in New Mexico. During the 80s, they had the Ditch Witch campaign, and what they did was they used the image of like the Llorona as a way to deter kids from being on playing in the ditches and arroyos. And so this is like in the 80s, they like the city of Albuquerque, the state of New Mexico, and all those organizations came together to do this because we were pretty wild back then. We would go and play in the ditches, and then it'd rain, and then we kids get swept away and stuff like that too. And it's just dangerous, right? And so they use that imagery still as a way to deter kids from doing that, even to the extent where they like hired storytellers to go to schools and tell these stories. And I remember like being a little kid at school here in Albuquerque where they did that, and they had this storyteller, and she had like long black hair. She just looked like a witch, right? Like, and she told us all these stories, and she told us the story of the Llorona, and that's why we needed to stay away from the arroyos because she would come and steal us and stuff like that. And I mean, they kind of told us like it was also dangerous, but it was more of that, and like it really helped I think to deter kids from going there. But it was all this, and these are like they had t-shirts and stuff like that. It was even like billboards, like ditches are deadly, stay away. Which was pretty interesting too. Then there's also like cuentos and stories and dichos and stuff like that too. I shared some of these already with you, but there's a bunch like that we hear about a lot here in New Mexico, which is always a cool thing because we have a great history of folklore here. Like I said before, I wanted to share a couple of books too with you guys that you guys can check out too that are pretty awesome for this as well. And you guys actually have I gave you a couple of samples from the books. This one's Cuentos from My Childhood. Oops, you can't really see it there. Cuentos from My Childhood by uh Paulette Atencio. This is a cool one too. So check that out. That's awesome. This is a close family friend. His name is Ray John de Aragon. Hold on, let me just fix this real quick. Um, Ray John de Aragon, his book, this one's called the New Mexico Book of the Undead. And this one's about like goblins and ghouls, kind of that kind of folklore. Here, this is a great one. Ray John de Aragon's also the one that wrote Hermanos de la Luz, the one that I showed you guys before. Another one from him is called Enchanted Legends and Lore of New Mexico. This one's awesome too. All these you can buy on Amazon too. This, like I said, Ray John de Aragon. He also has he wrote a book called La Cuento de la Llorona, which was another one. I actually was in a play that they did. They did like a live action play of the story of La Llorona, and we toured all over the Southwest and even in California and stuff like that too, in the play. But it was a great way to keep those traditions alive. Bueno, well, I hope you guys enjoyed this. Make sure you get your work done and keep moving forward. I look forward to hearing some of your folklore and stuff like that. That's what you're going to be doing this week. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Bueno, bye.